So these are the things I'm planning to cover. So fossil fuel companies, how do they drive climate change? The obvious answer to that question is that they produce 55% of the world's carbon emissions. The oil, gas and coal that they produces 55% of the world's carbon emissions. So they are contributing more than half of what is actually causing climate change. But they also lobby governments and other organisations to prevent effective climate legislation. They take legal action against countries who introduce effective climate legislation. They take subsidies, which should be going into other solutions to climate change. They have systematically over decades worked to try and undermine the idea that climate change is a problem. They've known it was coming for decades, and they have been trying to make it look small and safe. And my internet connection is not great, so I'm sorry if there's a problem, wave at me and I will take a break and then hopefully it will come back. But the biggest problem with fossil fuel companies is that even though the production that they already have in place, so even though the coal mines and the oil fields and gas fields they already have producing oil and coal and gas are enough to take us over the danger level of 1.5 degrees of global warming, they are still developing new reserves, and that means that they're actually exploring for new fields, they're developing those fields and they're starting those up. So they're planning to produce far more than the world can take in order to push us over that point. And the thing to remember is that unless we cut our carbon emissions by 2030, then we are essentially going to push the world into catastrophic climate change. And that means that new fossil fuel projects have to be stopped right now, and that existing production has to be halved. So they're not only carrying on producing at normal levels, they're also actually producing new fossil fuel projects at the moment. So this is the kind of underlying problem with fossil fuel companies. It's why it seems to Climate Action Leicester and Leicestershire that it would be worth pushing our pension fund to stop investing in oil and gas companies. And what is the pension fund actually currently doing? So currently they have about £154 million invested in Shell and BP and Glencore and these other organisations who you can see on the left-hand side of the page. And that's the figures. So this was a piece of research done last year, and the pension boards say that it's not accurate. And it might not be accurate because how much they have invested at any point goes up and down. But it gives you a rough idea of how much they have invested, and that they do have a substantial amount of money that this pension fund, Leicester and Leicestershire and Rutland Pension Fund, which is a joint pension fund, does have a phenomenal amount of money invested in fossil fuel companies. And it's about 3.7% of the fund. And what the pension fund are doing is they are looking at which of their investments have what they call a high climate risk. Now, their definition of a high climate risk is not the same as my definition of a high climate risk. And I will go into what that means in a minute. But basically, they're saying these companies have high climate risk, and they've got a list of kind of their top 10 danger companies. Shell and BP are on that list, but none of the other people who you can see here that they're investing in are on that list. And then what they're doing is they're engaging with these companies. So they're essentially trying to put pressure on these companies to improve their carbon footprint. That's what they mean by engaging. And as you can see from the consultation they've just put out to their members, they are also in the process of producing a climate strategy. And this climate strategy is designed to reduce the fund's climate risk. And the consultation shows you what they're planning to do, what they're thinking about doing. So this is where the pension fund is at the moment. In terms of Climate Action Leicester and Leicestershire, I have been going to their meetings for a year and a half now, and I have been reading their paperwork in between the meetings. That means I've been reading hundreds of pages of paperwork in between every meeting. So I suspect that I have a fairly good grip on what they're doing, a fair understanding. But essentially, the committee is made up of councillors who are not, they're councillors, most of them with a financial background, not all of them, but they're not finance people. This is not their area of specialism. So they're very dependent on the people who advise them. So this is where the pension fund currently is. And this is their definition of climate risk. Their definition of climate risk is that some investments will lose returns. They'll get less money from their investments for some of their investments as climate change worsens. So, you know, a food company might get less food, sell less food because they have less food because there's less food grown in the world. And that might result in less profit for the pension fund. That's their definition of climate risk. In the case of fossil fuel companies, the obvious climate risk is that the fossil fuel companies stop being able to sell their product, oil and gas, as we switch to renewable energy, and that therefore the value of the share becomes worthless. So this is the definition of climate risk. Obviously, from Climate Action's perspective, when we talk about climate risk, we're talking about the risk that climate change poses to our futures, to the world, to everybody and to every community all across the world. We're not talking about a small financial definition that the fund are talking about. So when you see them talking about climate risk, they're talking about financial risk to the pension fund, not financial risk to the companies they invest in, but financial risk to the pension fund based on their investments. And obviously climate change does have a direct cost on pension funds. And the obvious, you know, if I was to give you an obvious example at the moment, the energy crisis and the cost of living crisis is pushing up inflation. As inflation rises, the amount that the pension fund has to pay out to its pensioners rises, but their income doesn't rise automatically. So that's obviously a risk to the pension fund. Equally, and I would say the biggest risk, which I'm not sure they've fully comprehended yet, to be honest, is that as climate change gets worse, floods and storms and fires and all of those other things that come with climate change, sea level rise, cause a loss of the key infrastructure that enables those companies to work. So they might stop being able to transport their goods, or they might stop being able to manufacture their goods, or they might stop being able to get the materials that they need to manufacture their goods. Or, you know, there are loads of key infrastructures that every business needs to keep going. Those are put at risk by climate change. So those are direct costs to the pension of climate change, but they're not automatically the things that they think about when they're thinking about climate risk. When they're thinking about climate risk, they're talking about the loss of income from their investments specifically. And that is a big risk, but there's a lot of other things that are risks too as climate change gets worse. So like I've said, the pension fund has about £154 million invested in fossil fuel companies. And there's this concept called social license. Social license is when what you do, in this case as a pension fund, gives a license to a company to behave in a particular way. So essentially it's the idea that, in this case, their investments in oil and gas companies send a message to the public and to the government and to the businesses that what they are doing is acceptable, that they can carry on doing whatever they like, and that's fine. So what the fund is doing by investing in these companies is providing social license for them to continue producing oil and gas and coal. And obviously that is a problem, because essentially what they're saying is that the companies' exploration of new fuels, that them opening up new reserves and them undermining climate legislation is an acceptable thing to do. And yes, they're engaging with those companies, but how effective is that engagement going to actually be when they are a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of the shareholders, like a minuscule, invisible fraction of the shareholders, and they have a limited amount of time and energy with which to push those companies? So this concept of social license is really important, because the pension funds often talk as if when we ask them to stop investing in fossil fuel companies, we imagine them taking that money away from the companies will make a big difference. Obviously it won't, because it's a drop in the ocean of the money that they spend. What does make a big difference is that pension funds, and specifically local government pension funds, carry a lot of clout when it comes to social license. And the reason for that is because of what they represent. So a local government pension fund represents, or all pension funds represent, a need for a secure future, everybody wanting a secure future and an attempt to develop a secure future. They also represent public sector workers, and people who work in the public sector generally do it because they actually want to help people and they care about people. So when an organisation that represents public sector workers says oil and gas companies, go ahead, carry on doing whatever you like, there's a problem. They are elected by the public. And that means that in theory, they should be doing what the public wants. Now, the public wants action on climate change. So what they should be doing is acting on climate change. But instead, no, they're investing in oil and gas companies and they're providing social license. And of course, the employers' money, the contributions made by the employers comes from our taxes. It comes from the money that we pay in council tax that they get from the government, which we pay in tax to the government. So they are essentially employing people and paying contributions for people with money that we have paid. So they are directly taking our money. In other words, I am complicit. I don't personally have a pension in this fund, but I am complicit in what this fund does because it's taken my council tax and it's used it to fund oil and gas, to give social license to oil and gas companies. But there's another issue with the investment in fossil fuels, and that is the risk to the pension fund financially, because fossil fuels are a risky investment. It's the reason that 2 of those companies are in their top 10 risk category, because at some point they are going to be left with what's called stranded assets. Now, that is the idea that at some point the shares in that company become worthless and they can't sell them because nobody wants them. And we've seen a really good example of that with their shares in Russian oil and gas recently. The pension funds have all been rushing to divest from oil and gas because of the war in the Ukraine. And they've had trouble selling their shares because everybody else is rushing to sell them as well, because they have become worthless on the international market, or less valuable on the international market. And these organizations I'm showing you here, Kodak had this moment when the bubble popped for Kodak, when digital photography came in, and suddenly the film that Kodak produced was worthless, and they went from being one of the top 100 companies in the world to being worthless, and their shares became unsellable. It happened with Blockbuster Videos when Netflix came along. It happened to typewriters when computers came along. And it is about to happen to fossil fuel companies as a result of renewable energy becoming affordable. Renewable energy is now much cheaper than most fossil fuels. It is pretty much reaching the point now that it is cheaper than all fossil fuels. So the only thing stopping it from popping right now, the carbon bubble, is that we need a way to save, to store renewable energy, the battery technology. And the battery technology is coming on extremely fast. So at any moment now, and it's not dependent on the battery technology, but even without that, it's likely that the fossil fuel companies, the shares that this pension fund has in oil and gas companies will become worthless. They will be unable to sell them. And at that point, they've lost 3.7% of the funds that they have, which they could have moved to something else, which would have been profitable for the fund. So it's a risk to the fund to continue investing in these companies. And they know that. That's why they've done that climate risk assessment. I don't think they feel it's as risky as we do, but that's because they're not listening to the advisors that we're listening to. They are hearing from a very specific set of people. So why are they doing this? Why are they investing in oil and gas? Essentially, I would say that the reason that they're doing this is not because they think it's good financially, they know it's not, and not because they're legally required to, because they're definitely not legally required to. There are government pension schemes that are stopping investing in oil and gas companies right now. It's because they believe in responsible investment. The idea of responsible investment is that you use your shares to push companies to behave better. And as Climate Action, we would say responsible investment is a really good thing if the company you are engaging with has the capacity and the interest to change. But fossil fuel companies have their entire business based on the sale of fossil fuels. They are not going to suddenly start selling renewable energy, largely because the market has been, already taken by other companies that are developing it. And they are also not going to change their entire business method when currently it's quite profitable for them to do it. So I would say that their belief in responsible investment in the case of fossil fuels is misplaced. Although engaging with companies that can change is obviously a good idea. They also, as a committee, the individual people in the committee seem to have a fairly deep-rooted belief that at some point the fossil fuel companies are going to become part of the solution to climate change. They're going to develop some kind of techno-fix. And I think the techno-fix they're hoping the fossil fuel companies specifically will develop is carbon capture and storage. So the reason that I don't believe that fossil fuels are going to be the underlying developers of these technological solutions is that they're only putting a very small fraction of the money that they get into this kind of research, into renewable energy, into carbon capture and storage, while the vast majority of their money is still going into the development of new fossil fuels. So yes, they are doing this to a small extent, but there are lots of other companies out there which are focusing all of their energies on this, and obviously they're going to be the ones who actually drive the development of these solutions as and when they happen. Okay. So what we are asking the pension fund to do instead of investing in fossil fuel companies is to make a public statement and commitment to stop investing in fossil fuel companies. And the reason we want it to be public is because the whole point of making a public statement is to stigmatize what those companies are doing. It is to say it is not acceptable to carry on producing oil and coal and gas when it is pushing the world into catastrophic climate change. And when they do that, they will encourage both members of the public and ordinary private people to stop investing in those companies. And they will also encourage the government to put in place legislation that will force those companies to change what they are doing. So the point of asking the fund to divest from fossil fuels is that it stigmatizes the action of the company, making it more likely that there will be national and international legislation that will actually stop them from doing what they are doing, which is producing more and more oil and gas, even though they know that we're going to end up in catastrophic climate change as a result. So that's the first thing we're asking them to do. Obviously, we don't want them to make any new investments in fossil fuel companies. And then what we would like them to do is to focus their engagement on banks and insurance companies who they invest in. Because banks and insurance companies are the key enablers of new fossil fuel production. They provide the loans, they provide the insurance that enable the fossil fuel companies to then go out and develop new sites of new production. So those are companies that they could engage with, because those are companies that can change their business method. They are capable of actually saying, no, we're not going to fund fossil fuel companies anymore. We're going to focus our funding on everybody else instead. And obviously that would make a massive difference. In fact, there's a very, very effective campaign being run in Africa at the moment as a result of an oil pipeline, where campaigners have been targeting insurance companies one after the other. So every time that the fossil fuel company who want to open this pipeline try and get it insured, there's pressure put on that particular insurance company to make sure they don't insure it. And so far, this has been fairly effective. So the last thing we would like to see them doing in terms of their fossil fuel investments is to shift that money specifically. So like I say, it's about 3.7% of the fund, it might be a bit less. Shift that into local renewable energy projects and local home energy insulation projects, things in Leicester and Leicestershire and Rutland that would both cut our carbon footprint as a county and help people to survive as a result of the cost of living crisis and the energy crisis. So that's what we would like to see them do instead. But then all their other investments, we would like them to put in some very clear criteria saying you have to move towards net zero. And I'm not going to go into the details, but there's something called Climate Action 100+, who have a set of very accurate criteria and who report on many of the top 100, the top hundreds of companies that our fund is invested in. They report about how they're doing against a lot of criteria. And the obvious thing for the pension fund to do would be to say, in order to continue investing in you, you have to meet these criteria. Okay, now next year you have to meet these criteria. Next year you have to meet these criteria, pushing them to act faster. and they should use their voting rights to vote against the re-election of directors in those companies until they meet those requirements. Now, what they do with engagement at the moment largely consists of occasional letters or voting. If someone stands a motion saying, you know, you should do more about climate change, they would vote in favour of that motion. But what they are not doing is this systematic voting against the re-election of directors in companies. And as a minuscule shareholder, that is something they can do that is effective within a company. They can do that. If you're interested in that, I will post in the chat in a minute a really simply written but quite long article by a financial analyst who has done a lot of research in this about what pension funds can do that is effective to reduce fossil fuel extraction. And it's very noticeable that what she is proposing in no way matches up with the measures that the pension fund are proposing in this consultation that they have put out. Things they are putting in place do not, from our perspective, result in the fund changing the behaviour of fossil fuel companies, and also probably doesn't result in the fund actually stopping. It doesn't result in the fund encouraging companies to actually go faster to net zero, which obviously is the other big thing that's important. So I'm pretty much going to stop there, but as individuals, there are three things I would say that we can do. Three easy, like starting point, easy things. We can sign the petition that Climate Action is running to this committee, asking them to stop investing in fossil fuels. I will put a link in the chat in a moment. We can respond, if we are members of the fund, we can respond to their consultation saying, measures you're proposing here are the wrong measures. What you should be doing is stopping investing in fossil fuel companies, publicly stopping investing in fossil fuel companies, and instead doing the other things I was saying there. Or they can come up with their own set of criteria, but the point is the things they're currently considering, we don't think they're going to be effective. They essentially put them in the middle of the curve towards net zero. It's a safe option from the fund, it's an easy option from the fund, but it doesn't result in them pushing companies to act faster. And we think that's what they should be doing. And if you want to get involved in the campaign, then join our working group. We've got loads of stuff going on. It would be lovely to have a few more people doing. So I would like to share these really useful links with you. Our website page includes links to the petition, to the consultation, to the slideshow from tonight. And it also includes a link to various other useful things in relation to our campaign, our climate and pension scheme campaign. But I'd also like to draw your attention to this really excellent article at the end of this page, the last link on this page, which has been written by a financial advisor about the ways in which pension funds can actually make a real difference in terms of climate change. And the great thing about this writer, she's an academic, she's not just coming from a financial background, and she knows how to write clearly for ordinary everyday people. So it's a really interesting, engaging article, which is written in everyday English about what the pension fund can do. And I would wholeheartedly recommend that. And also, if you're interested in what the companies, various businesses across the world are doing in terms of meeting action for climate change, then the Climate Action 100+ criteria and which companies are doing what are on the email on the website address here. And I, again, really recommend them. They have a list of criteria. A lot of them are about data and about commitments and about ways of measuring and informing people about what they're doing. And obviously those are not the things that make a real difference, but it also includes their proper targets for carbon reduction, and it includes what they are doing in terms of capital expenditure, and also how they're tying their directors' payments to their climate record. And those are the things that do make a difference to a company actually acting on climate change. So there's a lot of criteria in there that are not the underlying ones in terms of, from a climate action perspective, tackling climate change, but there's also some really important criteria in there, which are the ones that would make a real difference to a company reducing its carbon footprint. Okay, so essentially our reading of the consultation is that they are basically considering a set of measures which amount to business as usual. Those measures only address the financial risk to the fund and not the risk that climate change addresses to us, to the fund and to all of us. We think that the measures that they're proposing would be unlikely to put them ahead of the Western world's curve to net zero, which is clearly, if they want to push companies to act faster, then the measures they put in, we would say, need to actually be ahead of that curve. And therefore, the measures that they're suggesting would not send a signal to companies that they're invested in that they should move to net zero more urgently. So what I've done is I've gone through the consultation questions and I've picked out the ones that I think are worth responding. Is I've put in green the questions I think are worth answering, and the way they've set up the consultation is at the beginning there's 3 compulsory questions. So you have to say who you are and you have to give your national insurance numbers to prove that you're in the fund, and then they have asked compulsory questions. You can't move to the non-compulsory questions unless you answer the compulsory questions. So the compulsory questions are about very specific measures. And they are what they're calling primary measures. Should the fund have a ambition, a measure of net zero by 2050 for its investments, with an ambition for sooner? That's their first question. Should the fund have that ambition? And it's like, well, yeah, that's a good idea. And ideally, you would have it sooner in order to be ahead of the curve. So, you know, you could change the target to be for 2040. But unless you divest from fossil fuel companies, you're still providing social license for the thing that's driving climate change. So from our perspective, yeah, it's a relatively decent measure. It could be changed to be better, but it's not the measure that will make the difference. So from our perspective, what you would do is you would respond to that question by saying, I support this measure, but it's the wrong question. You're considering the wrong measures. The second question that they are asking about is, should they be aiming for a 40% in net carbon emissions by 2030 for their listed equity asset class? So that's the shares that they have in public companies, people like Shell and BP and Glencore. And it's like, yeah, of course we think that they should reduce their net emissions from all of the companies. So this applies to all of the companies. These are not questions about fossil fuel companies. Of course they should reduce them. I don't think a 40% target is big enough, given that we need a 50% reduction by 2030. But, you know, again, it's not an unreasonable measure, but it's the wrong measure, because what they should be doing is stopping investing in fossil fuels. And the third question that they have is, should they reduce the carbon intensity of the fund's portfolio? So the measure of carbon intensity is that you basically take the carbon footprint of the fund and you divide it by the value of, you take the carbon footprint of the company and you divide it by the value of their profits, of the money that they make. So if, as in the case with Shell and BP right now, their profits have gone through the roof because they've got exactly the same carbon footprint, but suddenly they're making a lot more money because oil and gas have become much more valuable all of a sudden. What that does is it reduces their carbon intensity, even though their carbon footprint has in fact stayed exactly the same. So carbon intensity is only a useful measure when it's used with a set of other measures. And carbon intensity has to include scope 3. And as far as I know, it doesn't currently. The fund is not requiring it to include scope 3. So scope 3 is the carbon footprint of your product when it is used. Obviously, if you're an oil and gas company, a large part of your carbon footprint is when your oil and gas is used, is burnt and causes climate change. And if you're a solar panel, you have a minuscule scope 3 carbon footprint because you're producing energy with a very low carbon footprint. So unless they include scope 3 and make sure that they use other measures, this is not a terribly useful measure, but it is So, you know, again, the position that we would take as Climate Action is that these 3 compulsory questions you're being asked at, what we would suggest you do is that you basically write a paragraph which says, sorry, let me try and find, you know, that says what I was saying earlier, this. Write a paragraph that says, these are the wrong measures. They're quite good measures, you know, you could improve them, I'd like you to improve them, but what you should be doing instead is moving away from fossil fuels publicly, investing in local renewable energy and home insulation, if you want to, and then putting in, for all your remaining investments, a requirement for those companies to reach net zero quickly, measured in specific ways. And we would suggest this use of the Climate Action 100 criteria, not just some of them, but all of them, because like I say, companies, a lot of them are about reporting and about data. They're not actually about real things. A lot of them are about targets and commitments, as opposed to about real change. But there are a set of things in there which are genuinely good. And then they should systematically vote against the re-election of all the directors in those companies at every AGM until they meet those requirements. So if I was responding to this consultation, what I would do is I would take this idea that I've got on this page and I would write a paragraph summarizing that in my own words, and then I would cut and paste it into the further comments box for each of those first 3 questions. And that would be, you know, and I would also say, you know, because I'm me and I like to cross my T's and dot my I's, I would also say the ways in which they could improve the measures they're actually proposing. But I would make it very clear that whilst I'm not opposed to the measures that they're proposing, they're the wrong measures. They're not the measures that they should be doing if they're serious about tackling climate change. So that's the first 3 questions, the 3 compulsory ones. The questions that we think are worth responding to are optional. You don't have to respond to them. Question 14 asks you directly, should they be divesting or should they be engaging? And we think that they should be engaging with the companies that are going to change and divesting from companies who should not be given social license to continue what they're doing. So, you know, this section of the consultation has been set up in such a way that it doesn't have a comments box at the bottom of every question. So you would have to say that you were in favour of divestment, and then when you get to the final question, there's, do you have any more comments? In there, you would put your comments about this, saying, you know, divest from fossil fuels, etc., etc. So, you know, this is the question that we actually think is the important question. The wording at the top of the page in black and white is their wording of the question. And then our answer is what's in green, what we would say. The other question that we think is worth responding to is question 7, which is their secondary measure 4. Should they reduce the proportion of the fund with fossil fuel exposure in their equity portfolio? And they're saying that that's 8.5% of their equity portfolio. And it's like, well, yeah, of course they should. In fact, they should remove fossil fuel exposure as far as they can, because at some point they're going to get stranded assets, and that's going to be a risk to the pension funds. But also they should, so we think they should increase this target to 80% by 2030. And we think that it needs a 2025 target as well. I mean, they're only setting targets. Their secondary measures are all about targets for 2030 for the funds. And the thing is, 2030 is too late in terms of tackling climate change. We have to have halved the world's carbon footprint by 2030. So clearly, as a pension fund, they should have a 2025 target at the absolute least, and preferably a 2027-28 target as well, because otherwise there is no way of knowing whether it's actually happening fast enough. So we think it is worth saying these things. So the way we've put our briefing together, and again, I'll put it in the chat bar, is that we think that they should, we've put the question number on the left. In the middle column, we've put the points that we would make to the committee. And then on the right-hand side, we've put comments so that you understand what's in the thing or what we're thinking in terms of this, what underlies our thinking, why we're saying that. So, because in December, they're going to do another consultation. They're going to finalize their climate strategy and they're going to do another consultation for members. And we need to get as many members as possible to actually understand what it is that their measures are, so that they are able to respond to that consultation, because that's going to be the shall we go ahead with the strategy or not consultation. And like this one's really important because, to be honest, once they've got a strategy in place, chances of them changing it as a result of the next consultation are lower. So if you want to know what any given company is doing in terms of their carbon footprint, then the thing to do is to go to the Climate Action 100+ website and look up the specific company, and you will be able to see ticks and crosses as to which of the criteria they are and aren't meeting. And that's quite a long-winded, detailed way of finding it out, but it will actually tell you if they've looked into that company and they are systematically working their way through as many companies as possible. And they are staying on top of it, like they're changing the data as it changes. So I would say go to the consultation, respond to the 2 green questions, question 7 and 14. You can't respond to question 14 in question 14. You have to go to the final comments box at the end of the consultation to do that, but at least click, divest rather than engage. And then obviously do respond to the blue ones, but say these are the wrong measures, you should be divesting. That would be our position. And then there's a whole load of other questions which are in grey. And they also have a question buried in there about carbon offsetting on question 15. Should they be allowing businesses to use carbon offsetting? And I would say, as Climate Action, we would say no, because most businesses at this point are using carbon offsetting as a way of dodging reducing their carbon footprint. Later down the line, carbon offsetting might actually be genuinely relevant, but at this point, if a company is primarily working using carbon offsetting, then they're not probably actually trying to reduce their carbon footprint with anything like the urgency that's needed. So that question might be worth responding to.